Okay, so get this. Today's deep dive, we're going back to the 1930s.
Okay.
And no, not for the fashion,
Right.
though I'm sure that's fascinating too. We're talking about something, a bit heavier.
Hmm.
Child labor in America.
Yeah.
Not exactly a walk in the park kind of topic,
Right.
but definitely important and something, we don't often hear a lot about these days, at least when it comes to this period in American history.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people, I think, tend to think of child labor as something from the distant past.
Right, like Dickens era stuff.
Exactly. But it was very much a reality in the 1930s, and this U.S. Department of Labor report from 1933 that you sent us, it really lays it all bare.
It's pretty intense stuff. Statistics, firsthand accounts, really eye-opening.
It's a really, really valuable document. And it's not just about the data, it really gives you a sense of how people's attitudes towards child labor were starting to change during this period.
Okay, so let's set the scene a little bit.
Hmm.
Why is this specific report, this one from 1933, so significant? Child labor, it's got a long history. What makes this era, the 1930s, so noteworthy?
Well, you got to think about the context. The Great Depression, it was in full swing.
Right, unemployment was what, like 25% at its peak?
Yeah, something like that. Families were desperate. And child labor, even though more and more people were starting to oppose it,
Right,
it was often seen, as a necessary evil.
yeah. It's easy to judge looking back, but for a lot of these families sending their kids to work, I mean, it wasn't a choice.
No,
It was survival.
it was survival, absolutely. And that's what makes this report so fascinating, I think, because even in the middle of all this hardship, right, this terrible economic crisis, you can see that seeds of change are starting to be planted.
How so?
Well, you had social reformers, labor unions, even some businesses starting to say, hey, we need to do better for these kids. We need to protect them.
So this report, it really captures that tension. You've got this really harsh reality on one hand, and then this desire for a better future, at least for kids, on the other.
Precisely. And it didn't shy away from showing just how bad things had gotten. In 1930, over 2 million children between the ages of 10 and 17 were working in the United States.
2 million.
Yeah.
That is insane. And to think, that's not even the whole picture, is it?
I'm afraid not. And the report itself even acknowledges that. These numbers, they only include kids aged 10 to 17. There's really no reliable data on kids under 10.
Under 10. Seriously, it's hard to even imagine. What kind of work were these kids, some as young as what, 6, 7 years old? What were they doing?
Well, the report highlights several industries with particularly high numbers of child laborers. Agriculture, it's no surprise, topped the list.
Right, the farms. Though, honestly, I always had this kind of romanticized image of kids working on farms, like it was a wholesome, healthy kind of life.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. The reality, as this report makes clear, was very, very different. It was grueling, backbreaking labor, often in really terrible conditions.
And we're not just talking about kids helping out on their family farms here. This was different.
Right. The report specifically talks about the rise of these large commercial farms that were heavily reliant on child labor, often from migrant families.
Oh, wow. So these kids were really being exploited.
Yes, and they often face the worst of the worst. Terrible housing, almost no sanitation, very limited access to education, if any at all.
It's horrible. It's a side of the agricultural industry that we don't always think about. Were there other industries that really stood out in the report?
Yeah, manufacturing was another big one. Canneries, in particular, were notorious for their terrible working conditions.
The report really goes into detail about the canneries, doesn't it? And it doesn't sound good. It seems like the location of these places played a big part in why they were so bad.
You're right. Canneries were often in rural areas, far from prying eyes, far from labor inspectors, really, which made them, ripe for exploitation.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And you have to remember, a lot of cannery workers, they were migrants. They were minorities, groups who already faced so much discrimination.
Right. They had very little power.
Exactly. It made them incredibly vulnerable to this kind of exploitation.
Yeah. It's a sad reminder that these issues, they often go hand in hand, don't they? So we got agriculture, manufacturing. But this report didn't just focus on those big industries, did it? What else was going on?
You're right. It wasn't just those big industries. The report actually, it goes beyond that and exposes some of the kind of hidden corners of child labor in the 1930s. Places like, private homes.
Private homes.
Yeah, where young people were employed as domestic servants.
Domestic service. See, that's not something you really think about right away when you think about child labor. I mean, you
Yeah.
picture factories, fields, that kind of thing.
Right.
But this was happening in people's homes.
Exactly. And because it was so unregulated, domestic service was particularly vulnerable to, exploitation.
Yeah, I keep
You
going.
had these young girls, I mean, many of them weren't even teenagers yet, working long hours, doing things like cooking, cleaning, childcare. And because they were living with their employers, it created all sorts of, opportunities for abuse. It was
Yeah, that's a really, really dark side of this whole thing.
right.
And again, like you said, it was hidden. It was happening behind closed doors.
Exact.
So much harder to, regulate, to even be aware of.
Mm.
This report's really, it's helping to kind of paint a more complete picture of what was going on.
Yeah.
Did it get into the specifics of the actual work? Like, what was the day-to-day like for these kids?
It did, yeah. So in addition to those statistics, the report includes these kind of vivid descriptions of the work children were actually doing.
Okay.
And it's heartbreaking. For example, in those canneries we were talking about,
Right.
children, some as young as 6 years old, 6 years old, were working alongside adults, often for 10, 12 hours a day.
Oh my gosh. In those conditions.
In those conditions, yeah, you can picture these young children, I mean, barely old enough to be in school, standing for hours on end in these hot, steamy factories, peeling tomatoes, snipping beans, husking corn.
It just sounds awful.
It was, and the report even talks about the constant risk of cuts and burns.
Oh yeah, with those the sharp knives and the boiling water.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
was a very real danger for these kids.
And the long hours, the heat, the exposure to, I don't know, everything in those factories. I mean, it must have taken a real toll on their health.
Absolutely. This kind of work had very real and very serious long-term consequences. The report actually draws a direct line between the conditions in these canneries and things like stunted growth, chronic pain, respiratory illnesses.
Wow. It's like their bodies were just breaking down.
Basically, yeah. You can see how these early experiences could have impacted these children for their entire lives.
Makes you wonder how common these health problems actually were and how aware people were of the connection to child labor. This report is full of these grim details that, I don't know, they really make you stop and think. Speaking of grim details, the report also goes into textile mills,
Right?
another one of those big industries we talked about earlier.
Yeah, textile mills were another major, major employer of child labor, especially in the American South. The work was incredibly demanding and dangerous, even for adults.
I've seen pictures of those mills, just
Yeah.
rows and rows of those huge, noisy machines. Hard to imagine anyone, let alone a child, spending hours and hours in that kind of environment.
Oh, it was awful. The noise was deafening. The air was thick with all this dust and fibers, and these kids were often operating dangerous machinery with very little training, if any at all. The report actually, it includes stories of children losing fingers, getting their hair caught in machinery, all sorts of horrible things.
It's one of those things where, like, the pictures, they don't really do it justice. You see a photo, you think, oh, that's a tough job. But the report, it highlights all these hidden dangers, things you wouldn't even think about.
Exactly.
Like you said earlier, it's really important to look beyond the surface.
It is.
So we've talked about factories, we've talked about fields, we even touched on domestic service. Were there any other areas where child labor was particularly prevalent?
Yeah, the report, it also sheds light on what was called the street trades.
Street trades.
Yeah. It was a sector that, while it wasn't as visible as the factories or the farms,
Right.
it still employed a significant number of children.
What does that even mean, street trades?
So think like newsboys.
Oh, okay, like delivering newspapers.
Exactly, shining shoes, that kind of thing. We've all seen those images in old movies and stuff, but
Yeah.
the reality was, well, it was far less glamorous.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. The report describes newsboys, some as young as 8 or 9.
8 or 9.
Working long hours, often late into the night, selling newspapers on street corners, exposed to all kinds of weather, scorching heat, freezing rain, and they often had to navigate some pretty dangerous neighborhoods.
And carrying those huge bundles of newspapers. You ever tried carrying a stack of those things? It's not easy. Even as an adult, I can't imagine what it must have been like for those kids, hauling those things around all day.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the weight, it was the constant standing, the walking, often for hours on end. The report actually, it links this type of work to things like foot problems, back pain, respiratory illnesses, even stunted growth.
Wow. It's crazy to think about all the ways that child labor could impact these kids' health. It really is eye-opening. I think it's easy to think about child labor as this problem of the past, but it was so widespread, and it touched
Yeah.
almost every aspect of American life back then.
Absolutely. Child labor was deeply, deeply embedded in the fabric of American society. And while this report, it paints a pretty grim picture, it also highlights this growing movement that was pushing for change, for laws and regulations to protect these children.
So there was some pushback starting, some actual movement toward change.
Yeah, definitely. One of the big things at the time was this push for compulsory school attendance laws.
Oh, okay, to try and keep kids in school longer.
Exactly. The thinking was, if you can keep kids in school, you can keep them out of the factories and fields.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But we all know that passing a law and actually enforcing it are two very different things.
Oh, tell me about it.
Was that an issue back then, too?
Oh, yeah. Big time. The report actually, it shows that there was a ton of variation from state to state.
Oh, really?
Yeah, even within states when it came to enforcing these attendance laws.
So some kids were still slipping through the cracks.
Sadly, yes. Especially, in rural areas where agricultural work was often exempt from these laws. And then those industries like domestic service, I mean, how do you even begin to enforce that?
Right, it's happening in people's homes. So
Exactly.
much harder to track. It's so frustrating, but I guess not all that surprising to hear that these loopholes existed even back then. What about minimum age laws? Was there any movement on that front?
Definitely. There was a huge push to establish a minimum age for employment. Like, people were really starting to question this whole idea of children, especially young children, working at all.
Well, yeah, it seems like a no-brainer now, but back then, I imagine that was a pretty radical idea for some folks, especially those who relied on that child labor.
Oh, absolutely.
So what was the minimum age they were pushing for?
The report talks about a big push for a 14-year minimum.
14. 14? Are you serious? I mean, even 14 seems way too young to be working, especially in those dangerous jobs we've been talking about.
I know, right?
And I'm sure there were exceptions written into that, too.
Of course. Wouldn't be a law without exceptions.
Hmm.
Right.
Let me guess. Agriculture.
Bingo.
Hmm.
And domestic service, too. You're right. Those most dangerous jobs, the ones that really needed regulating, they were always the hardest to, regulate.
Yeah, the kids who needed the most protection were often the least protected. It's a pattern we see over and over again throughout history. It's disheartening, but I guess not all that surprising. So, okay, they're trying to get these minimum age laws in place, but were there any efforts to, address those really dangerous occupations, even if the kids were technically old enough to work?
Yeah, absolutely. The report actually goes into this in quite a bit of detail. There was a growing movement to try to regulate what were considered, dangerous occupations for minors.
Dangerous occupations. So basically acknowledging that even if a kid was, say, 14, there were still some jobs that were just too risky for them to be doing.
Exactly.
Okay, so what kinds of jobs were they targeting? Give me some examples.
Well, they were looking at things like, operating dangerous machinery, working with hazardous chemicals, any job that involved, like, heavy lifting or prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures, things like that.
So trying to get kids out of the factories, the mines, I imagine those canneries too.
Yes, all of that. And, farms too, like operating farm equipment. There was this growing understanding that young people were just especially vulnerable to workplace accidents, long-term health problems.
I mean, their bodies are still developing, their brains, they don't have the same judgment as an adult.
Right. They just weren't equipped to navigate those kinds of environments safely.
It all sounds very, I don't know, sensible, like common sense. But like we've been talking about, common sense doesn't always translate into, effective action. So what does the report say about how successful these regulations actually were?
It's kind of a mixed bag, to be honest. I mean, the report, it shows that some progress was definitely being made,
Okay.
but enforcement was a huge issue.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, how do you police every single farm, every factory, especially in those more rural areas like we talked about?
Right. And the report, it talks about how limited resources and a lack of manpower made it almost impossible for labor inspectors to really do their jobs effectively.
Not enough people to go around.
Yeah. And on top of that, even when violations were discovered, the penalties were often so small that they didn't really deter employers from breaking the law.
Wow. It's like, what's the point then? Right.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And it goes back to that same issue we keep bumping up against: the most vulnerable kids, those in the most hidden corners of the workforce. They were always the hardest to protect.
Right. Like you said earlier, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Exactly. It's a pattern we see time and time again.
But the good news is that people weren't giving up. That's what's so inspiring about all of this. Even with the setbacks, the challenges, they kept fighting for these kids.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I love about this report, honestly. It shows this real change in the way people were starting to think about child labor. Before this, it was like a private family matter. What happens in this family stays in this family.
Right, kids working was just normal.
Yeah, but this report shows this growing understanding that we as a society have a responsibility to protect children, regardless of their family situation.
It's a huge shift. Moving away from that kids should be working
Yeah.
mentality toward, like, a kid should be in school. Kids
Yeah.
should be protected mentality.
Restricted.
It's a whole new way of looking at childhood.
Right. It really is. And while the 1930s, I mean, it was obviously an incredibly difficult time for so many people, it was also this period where we see these really significant changes in social attitudes and policies related to child labor.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even in the darkest of times, progress is still possible.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into child labor in the 1930s, a time that, as we've seen, was full of these contradictions, I mean, what's the key takeaway here? What can we learn from this report, from this little window into the past?
Well, I think it shows us that progress, it's rarely linear. There are going to be setbacks, there are going to be challenges, and that's okay. That's normal. But it shouldn't stop us from pushing for change, from fighting for what's right.
Right, you've got to keep going, keep fighting for those who can't fight for themselves.
Exactly. And it highlights just how important these legal frameworks are, how crucial it is to have strong enforcement mechanisms in place, especially when it comes to protecting vulnerable workers.
Because without those protections, those safety nets, it's just too easy for exploitation to happen.
It is. And finally, I think it underscores something we've touched on a couple of times now. The power of collective action. When individuals, organizations, governments, when they all come together to create a more just and equitable society, that's when real change happens.
A society where every child, regardless of their background or circumstances,
Yeah,
has the opportunity to learn, to grow, to reach their full potential, free from exploitation. I love that.
me too.
Well, there you have it. A deep dive into the world of child labor in the 1930s. A world that, despite its harsh realities, it offers some really valuable lessons for us today. Lessons about perseverance, about the importance of vigilance, and about our shared responsibility to create a better future for all children. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What can we do in our own time to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated? Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.